All right, good afternoon and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farm Conservation webinar. As you'll note, we are doing it a little different today. And so this is part of our Beyond the Basics series on cover crops. And I'm Matt Helmers. I'm joining you from the studio here in Elings Hall. And this is going to be a discussion about cover crops. And we have a series of these coming up in the future with different guests. But this week, I'm really excited to welcome first guest, what I'd say is one of the OGs of the Iowa Learning Farms. Mark was involved with the Learning Farms even before I was. And so we're gonna put Mark on the hot seat a little bit, talking about cover crops. Not the hot seat. We're gonna have a dialogue and discussion about cover crops. And so as we go through this, we welcome you all to type in the chat box your questions that you might have on anything related to cover crops. All right, somebody said they're not getting any sound. Okay, might have to check their volume if others can type in if you're hearing it, okay? So, yep, we need to make sure everybody can hear. Okay, we're getting a lot of I can hear you. So, okay, thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for chiming in. See, we got you off started on the right foot on getting some dialogue. So, I would normally say you didn't come to hear me, but I guess today you get to hear me at least ask the question. So, I'm excited for this, and I'm really excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Mark Licht. Mark is a cropping systems agronomist. Yep. Extension specialist in the Department of Agronomy. And Mark has been working on cover crops for quite a period of time. Mark, I'll let you introduce yourself and then I'll lead you into some questions.
Sure. So yeah, I started with Iowa Learning Farms, and that was really kind of my first exposure into cover crops. And really the real OG of cover crops is Tom Casper.
Absolutely.
Right?
And we need to give credit where credit between Tom Casper and Eileen Kladivko. Those are the
definitely.
Those are the godfather and the godmother of cover crops.
And I have learned a lot from them, and I continue to learn a lot from them. And so that's where I kind of got started with this. And then as I left Iowa Learning Farms and went out into being a field agronomist, I got to really work with farmers, obviously with a wide variety of things, but cover crops was one of those. And then as I came back to campus as a faculty member, I re-engaged with Iowa Learning Farms. I engaged with the Midwest Cover Crops Council. And so I really kind of came back to my roots in some respects of playing with cover crops and soil management, from a framework of crop production.
Yeah.
And cropping systems. And so now I think of it as I'm dealing with corn and soybean management, but I'm also, trying to think of how do we change those systems to be more sustainable or regenerative.
Yeah. So, some people might have questions on kind of cover crops and weeds. We're going to get into that in another session with Dr. Wesley Everman, mm-hmm. or plant diseases with Dr. Allison Robertson. So, if you have those, keep those for one of the next times. But, as I think about our cover crop journey, I do more work on the water quality mm-hmm. side, but I think about some of that. I think back to some of our first Iowa Learning Farms field days when we had cover crop field day, and we probably could count on the number on two hands how many people showed up. So we definitely have seen an increase in the interest of cover crops over the last 10 to 20 years.
Definitely. And in addition to the increase of the, people coming to workshops, field days, we are seeing an increase in the number of acres. A decade ago, if we had 100,000 or 200,000, it would have been doing really well. And now we're really looking at, we're over 1 million. We're roughly in the 5 to 10% of our corn and soybean acres.
Yeah.
So I think we have made some really good progress through the years, right? There's still room to go. Yeah. I don't want, that 5 to 10%, to come out and everyone says, oh, we've done so well and that's all we need.
Yeah.
Oh no, we have to keep going. Estimates say, and as well as I do, right? We probably need roughly 40 to 50% of our corn and soybean acres with cover crop. Just to see the type of nutrient reduction progress that we really need to be making.
Yeah. And I think the one great thing about cover crops are multiple benefits. So, I think about it a lot from a nitrate perspective, but there are a lot of soil quality, soil erosion. If we think about protecting our our soil resource in the state, one of the most vital, assets, resources we have in the state. Cover crops can be really effective for protecting our system in those spring rainfall events.
Oh yeah, definitely. Spring is when we get the most amount of rainfall, right? And so having that, living root out there, holding the soil in place, the above ground biomass that's really, those roots in above ground biomass are taking up these nutrients. And then we get the side benefit of that, the above ground biomass really helping protect the soil from that raindrop impact. And so there's a lot of things, if we just think about the mechanisms of what's going on there, that come out and help us, right?
Yeah.
But then we get all these other benefits, that come with it. And so soil health, it may be, some forage material, for some livestock producers. It may be weed suppression, right? So there's a lot of, tangible benefits, but then kind of these ancillary benefits that come, around the edges.
Yeah, I really like the idea on the forages. I'm some people may know I'm a real fan of cattle grazing, and so if we can use, if that cover crop can provide us some forage value for that, that could be really attractive in certain areas of Iowa.
Yeah, and quite honestly, I think the forages, or maybe even now as we think about resistant water hemp, which again, Dr. Everman, he'll be on.
Yeah.
He'll answer all these questions, right? But these are some tangible things that really are money makers, right? They make this a very profitable, situation.
Yeah. Okay. Let's think about. I guess maybe you kind of talked about it on the adoption. I know there's been some work about folks maybe disadoption as well, or that there's still adoption and that's increasing, but then some people maybe stop using cover crops for whatever reasons. What do you see as maybe some of the barriers for why people might stop using it? And then, from your experiences, what might be some tricks or tips, God, tongue-tied here, tips to overcome some of those barriers?
Yeah, we do see this, right? The numbers are kind of telling us that, yes, the rate of adoption is still increasing, but that year over year is actually decreasing in the amount of new acres, essentially. And we do get reports and hear of farmers that are moving away from them again, right? So this is a real concern, and I think it does come back to the barriers. And so how do we kind of attack that and identify what's going on? And I liken it to it's a real big change to the cropping system as a whole, right? So it's not just, oh, they came out with a new hybrid, I'll put it in the planter boxes and I'll go. No, cover crop adoption means that we may be changing our tillage systems if we're not already no-till. We're changing our fertilizer program or timing of it a little bit, right? Or application methods. We're changing our herbicide program potentially. And if we're really, really wanting to make it work, we're probably going to need to change some of our corn and soybean management practices too, especially as you get more into it, right?
Okay.
I think some of I'll call them the expert, adopters or users, they've already figured out that, they'll change their management practices to give a little bit more time in the fall, a little bit more time in the spring to get good cover crop growth. That's again an advanced level, right? But it shows that we're going to have to change more than just adding it into the system.
Okay. All right. Now let's think about what cover crops folks might be able to use. I think probably the most widely used cover crop is rye. There may be some, questions about that as far as, the impact on the following corn crop when we're using there. What do you see as, either potential mixes to use or maybe other cover crops if we, if we have some hesitation, I guess, with winter cereal rye? Yeah,
and cereal rye ahead of corn is really one of the bigger barriers, right? And biggest challenges, I would say. And so, for someone that's never used cover crops, I would probably not tell them to use cereal rye ahead of corn. I'd tell them to start out with oats or like a spring barley or spring wheat in the fall that would then winter kill.
Okay.
It'd get them some nice good growth in the fall, and hopefully that'd take up some nutrients and protect the soil, or at least get us down that road, right?
Yeah.
But then they wouldn't have the challenges, with some of the early planting on corn, right?
Yep.
Soybeans don't tend to have the problem with cereal rye. So I still really like cereal rye in front of soybeans.
Okay.
It's robust. It comes through in a lot of situations.
And maybe we want that biomass and that kind of mulching effect throughout the summer.
Yeah, exactly. So thinking back to, should we think about mixtures or
Yeah.
something like that ahead of corn, and maybe replacing out that cereal rye? Yeah, I think there are. I think, maybe like crimson clover or a hairy vetch, something like that, mixed in with an oat or maybe even a winter triticale or a winter wheat, just because maybe that'll help those over winter a little bit better.
Okay.
But not have the same vigorous growth in the spring as a cereal rye would.
Yeah. So how about as we think about maybe some of those mixtures, some of our grains, the grasses, can grow pretty vigorously. When do we need to think about getting those mixtures, seeded to maybe give us the greatest chance of getting some growth in the fall?
I wish it was, as easy as just kind of a one size fits all, but
okay.
it unfortunately it's not. And it depends on which species you're putting into that mixture, right? So I think about the small seeded, crimson clover, even like a red clover. They're really, really small seeded. And so, yes, I'd like to see them get seeded earlier, in that mid to early September timeframe, right? Because that would give us the best chance to get some growth on them and get them up and going before we hit a frost. The downside is they're really hard to broadcast because they're so small seeded.
Okay.
And if you're looking at a mixture with oats or another small grain, now you've got a relatively large seed for cover crops with a very small seed, and that can present some seeding challenges from a mixture.
Yeah.
So that's a situation where if you do want to overseed, maybe look at let's see, something maybe like a radish and a hairy vetch with a small grain. Not the same seed size and seed densities, but much closer, right? And so again, if we can get them overseeded, we get some good rain on them, maybe they'll come through and get us the growth we want in the fall to overwinter well.
Yeah. Okay. Thinking about seeding, I listen when I hear your presentation. So I heard you this winter talking about maybe not thinking about pounds per acre, but seeds per acre. And especially as we think about rye, the number of seeds per, per bushel may be different. So, thinking about kind of seeds per acre, can you?
Yeah, so I think of it as seeds per acre, and really, a lot of these species that we're talking about are for small grains or are for forages. And in those situations, they're talking about pure live seeds. So not just number of seeds per acre, but how many live seeds you have per acre. And there's a couple things. The seed, when it's produced in that production year, if it's a stressful production year, it's going to change the seeds per pound. If it's a wet year, for instance, and it's a small grain, you may lose your seed quality, especially if you don't put fungicides on it. And so it's not just, it really comes back to the seed production year of what's your seed size, how many seeds per pound, that type of stuff, but also what's your germination percentage.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So you may put a bushel out, but if it was a stressful year, you may only be putting out a half bushel of live seeds. Right. So that's why thinking back and going, okay, what's the pure live seeds? So forget about, the seeds that aren't going to germinate. Forget about, maybe even hard seeds that likely won't germinate either, right?
Yeah. Thinking about kind of on that termination side, I've gotten some, questions. We had one just recently, but how about roller crimping for that termination? I think usually we're using herbicide termination. Kind of thoughts on roller crimping?
Yeah, so herbicides are the most common, largely because glyphosate does a really fantastic job with the small grains. Roller crimping has been, it's been around for quite a while. It mostly was showing up in the organic systems as a way of controlling weeds and prepping the fields, right? And so it does a really good job when you get the cover crop tall enough, right? Because you want to crimp that stem multiple times, and in order to do that, you need that that cover crop to be jointed out, probably 2 to 3 feet tall, before it'll start to crimp really well. And when I think of most of our corn and soybean acres, it's for grain, and so we're really conscientious of planting date on those to maintain yield levels. we would be losing yield potential if we waited long enough to terminate a
Okay.
cover crop with a roller crimper.
Okay.
And that's a challenge in our corn and soybean grain systems,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Not that it can't be done.
Yeah.
It's just now you're really thinking about how is it going to affect the bottom line,
Yeah.
how you're going to move things forward.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a cover cropper. I've been implementing. How long is it going to take for me to see maybe some of the benefits that I want to see? Where maybe soil health, maybe other
Oh,
factors?
this is a hard question.
Okay.
I like to say it depends.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And-
we're from the university, right? It's going to depend, But
Well-
we're also now extension folks. We're gonna
expand on that.
expand
Yeah.
on that. Yeah.
So it depends partly in who is detecting the change. Quite honestly, farmers tell us that they can start to see changes, in 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah.
They're seeing it in water infiltration, and they're seeing it in I'll call it field work suitable days.
Yeah.
Things like that, which tell me there is something happening.
Yeah.
The unfortunate part is that us as scientists, we're looking for such small changes, whether it's organic matter or infiltration rates or whatever.
And infiltration is so variable when we go out and measure it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So we're looking for small changes that and really for parameters that are quite variable, right?
Yeah.
And so it is really hard for us to detect changes within 5 years.
Okay.
It may even be, closer to 10 years before we can really start to detect, changes from a soil health perspective.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, kind of from those of us doing research in this is continuing to evaluate how we can best detect changes and, kind of, how many samples we need, all that kind of power analysis of thinking about that.
And we've done that. Iowa Learning Farms has done that a little bit in trying to think through what type of measurements can be made that we do think we'll see changes in faster, right? And I'd be remiss if I tried to, name them because I'd get them wrong.
Yeah.
But there are some things, and we tend to think of like aggregate stability and like respiration as two of them that, we might see a little bit quicker just because of, the mechanisms at play.
Yeah, and that's what we've seen in some work is that aggregate size distribution and aggregate stability improving, which, can help us, is an indicator of maybe some potential for improved infiltration, even if we can't measure it out in the field. I guess I'd make one comment is that as we think about it from a nitrate leaching standpoint, or even maybe from a soil erosion standpoint, we can see those benefits a lot quicker.
Oh, right away.
Yeah.
First year of adoption, you can start to see some of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that kind of, not necessarily on the water quality, but on the nutrient side, so we get this cover crop growing out there and we terminate it and we know there's some nutrients in that cover crop, nitrogen in that cover crop. Any sense of when that might be available, cycled back for available? That we have to remember there's a big organic nitrogen pool out there.
Yeah. And that's a question I probably am not, best equipped to answer. And hopefully we have someone coming on, in a later episode that can really dive into that. I think it's a question that really most farmers are asking, right? It's trying to understand some of those nitrogen dynamics. Yeah. We've done, myself and others have done trials looking at nitrogen rates and starter fertilizer. And really it's addressing when does, the nitrogen that's taken up by the cover crop, when does it become available again, and how do we supplement while it's not available?
Yeah. Probably kind of an area that we need to continue to do more research on as well.
Yeah, and I think that research needs to continue, because we don't fully understand it in cereal rye, let alone some of the other small grains. But as people start to adopt other cover crops, this question is going to start cycling down to those specifics as well.
Okay. All right, we're gonna. Okay. Here's a good one. What decision tools might be helpful for cover crop planning or decision making, particularly on the weather or climate side?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one too, because I often talk about with cover crops we have to be flexible. Okay. So I tell the early adopters plant 20 acres, half mile from the road, but yet on the home farm still, right? So you can keep an eye on it and adjust, right? So I think, that's the key is really thinking through and understanding that those cover crops are going to take up moisture in the spring. Okay. And so, we need to maybe have a break point or a critical date and kind of think about, okay, how much soil moisture do we have? How much rainfall do we have? Do we keep that cover crop going, or do we just get it terminated to hold moisture for the cash crop?
Yeah.
We could kind of think the same thing too from a termination standpoint. If you're wanting to plant your first cornfield on April 10th, that early planting date, back that up on termination, and you're going to have some challenges, right? And so you got to kind of think through, what's the weather conditions for termination? Do we have warm enough weather? Are nights and daytime temperatures warm enough to get that active growth for termination to happen effectively, right? And we're going to have to be flexible.
Yeah.
So just understanding, what's happening with the cover crop and how is that going to start interacting with the cash crop that we're hoping to get into, right?
Yep. Okay. So are there kind of, as we think about the potential for scaling this up, we got a multi-part question here, but we're going to start off is, do you see barriers to, having enough folks to fly on seed, whether that be airplanes or drones? Do we have enough folks out there to think about scaling this up, a few million more acres, or is that an opportunity, I guess?
It's definitely an opportunity, right? We know that the cover crop seed dealers and seed producers and even the custom seeders, whether it's an airplane or a UAV or high clearance, right? We have them out there now, but not at the levels we need if we're going to get to 40 or 50% of our corn and soybean acres.
Yeah.
Now, if we have steady year-over-year growth, we might be able to build it as we go.
Okay.
If we, for whatever reason, would have a large increase of acres, then we're going to see shortages of seed supply, lack of ability, and to really get it custom applied and/or timely custom applied, right? And so I think there are opportunities there. We do see, this is a great way, and we've got good examples of farmers that have brought the next generation in because they've added on a cover crop business, whether it's seed or whether it's the custom application, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there are ways to do this, right?
Yeah.
We're going to need a lot more. And I've heard you talk about this from the edge of field practices, like to get the number of edge of field practices, we need a lot more equipment and people that know how to run the equipment, right?
Yeah, the person power out on the landscape.
And it'll be the same thing with cover crop.
Yeah, I would say, kind of on that one, thinking about the drones, I'm or UAV, I know that we've had some Iowa Learning Farms field days and others as well, and I think it's kind of intriguing, potentially to be able to do some seeding that way, because it might reduce some of the barriers, and some folks might even be able to do it on their own if they have their own drones. Perhaps I don't know. Maybe a little more about some of the barriers there as well.
Well, I think we will see more farmers that are going to be willing to put out a $5,000 or $10,000 investment to have their own UAV to do some seeding. They might be able to do some spot spraying and things like that, right? So there are some real tangible benefits of moving to a UAV.
Yeah.
As well as it's a little bit more accurate.
Okay.
Airplanes have, there's something about power lines and airplanes, and so they have to get higher.
Or wind turbines too.
Yeah. So there are some challenges, right? But we find with UAVs we can get around some of those because we're flying much lower and quite honestly slower.
Yeah.
So I think UAVs are part of that answer, right? We can get a few more of them out there. We can keep moving with it. As far as like acres per day, an airplane's still going to be a lot faster, right?
Yeah.
It's part of the solution.
Yeah. Kind of like so many of these things, there's no one simple silver bullet.
Yeah.
Okay, we got a specific question here on cover crops, and they're asking, what cover crop or cover crop mix would you suggest for corn on corn operation? And this was specifically for canning in southern Minnesota.
Oh, for canning. So this is likely some corn that's probably coming out a little bit earlier too. So this is a good situation where maybe you are looking at a small grain like oats or spring wheat, something like that, where you can get some good growth out of it into the fall.
Yeah.
And it would terminate it, and so you'd be able to get in early enough in the spring. But I think here, depending on how early you can get in, you might look at like a buckwheat or a cowpea or something like that, because again, you can get a little bit bigger, mixture in there and longer growth period. So you might be able to get some benefits out of something like that.
Okay, great. Somebody brought up in the chat that Dr. Shalmar Armstrong has been doing some work on when the nitrogen from cover crops might become available. So that could be a good resource. If we have folks on, online that have questions, please type those in, and certainly if there are any farmers, what questions you have, please type those in. So one of the next one, kind of thinking about this release of nitrogen, would the timing of that end release from the cover crop depend on which cover crop it is?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't necessarily look at it from the species of cover crop. I look at it from the maturity of the cover crop.
Yeah.
And what I'm really thinking about is what is the carbon nitrogen ratio?
Yeah.
We know, like even cereal rye, when it's 6 inches tall, it has a fairly low CN ratio. It's under that 20-to-1. So we would be, basically decomposing it really quickly without needing to immobilize nitrogen.
Yeah.
Or take up that nitrogen, right? As we get all of them more mature, we tend to raise that CN ratio. Most of them are likely going to get at some point in their, as they get more mature, more into reproductive growth, then they're going to be probably above 30-to-1.
Okay.
And so then that's where you're going to see that nitrogen immobilization. So it's going to use the plant's going to use that nitrogen in the soil basically to decompose that root and shoot matter.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be as available until you get the cycling back for the cash crop, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I tend to think about most. And then you can kind of think about the species a little bit too. So the legumes tend to have a lower CN ratio than the grasses.
Okay.
And so there is a little bit of that comes into play as well.
Great. Thoughts on, thinking about monoculture cover crops, low diversity mixture or high diversity mixture?
So I've gotten myself into trouble, so I'm probably going to do it here.
Okay.
I personally am not a huge fan of a cover crop mixture that has more than 5 to 10 species.
Yep.
And they're out there. I know they are.
Yeah.
And so now you're probably going to get a lot of chats from dealers saying, no, that's not true. Well, let me explain. So when you have a whole bunch of species out there, the likelihood of getting them all to germinate and grow is kind of hit and miss, right? And so what I would say instead is target, what you want that mixture to be based on your goals.
Okay.
So you want erosion control. Well, okay, we want a small grain in there.
Yeah.
You want something that's going to do better ahead of corn. Okay, so this is where, a clover, a brassica, like radishes might come into play. And instead of cereal rye, you go to an oat, it's something like that. So kind of target, what a mixture would look like based on what your goals are, right? So that way you're going to get, the right species at enough density or plant density to do what you want it to do.
Yeah. So kind of thinking about, your objectives there, there was a question in there like, would you have a cover crop that you would suggest if you have kind of clay soils and you want to try to break up any, compaction and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so in those situations where you have that compaction layer, whether it's clay or whether it's a tillage layer, right? Think about those brassicas, just in general, right? They have a nice strong taproot, so they're going to push through those compaction layers, much easier than a grass, which is a more fibrous root system.
Okay.
So think about those brassicas. I've talked a little bit about
like our tillage radish.
I talked about the radishes, right?
Yeah.
That's what everyone thinks of. You get these big long tubers.
Right.
Well, I'll let you know that to get those big long tubers, you need to plant them in July.
Yeah. Let me tell you, they're also they're not as tasty as a parsnip. I had one time I thought I got a parsnip from a friend, and we made it for an Easter dinner, and one of my colleagues' children was very young and was eating it. And she was so conscientious and ate that. And then when all the adults ate it, we're like, oh yeah, this is not a parsnip. This was like a tillage radish. It was not good.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But, there are other species. So like rapeseed, some of the mustards have some really good taproots into them as well.
Yeah.
Yes, there are other species that have good taproots, can break down through those layers and really help us, right?
Yeah.
So.
Okay. This may be a little bit, I'll probably ask this one of what Dr. Everman when he's here. How do you balance the need for chemical weed control with potential carryover issues hurting any cover crop establishment? Or do we need to think about that a little bit as we think about some of the mixtures that we might be planting?
Definitely, we need to think about that. And so, yes, ask Wes, but just in brief, we do find that the residual herbicides that we're using for corn and soybean weed control can carry into the timing of when we're trying to establish a cover crop,
Yeah.
especially if it's a dry summer,
Okay.
right? And so
Yeah.
those dry summers that can cause some problems. The cereal grains are less problematic than the legumes. And then the brassicas, it's kind of species, specific on which ones are going to be affected and which ones aren't. There's good resources. Iowa State, Wisconsin, and I think Penn State and North Dakota have some extension publications that do talk about, things to consider at least, and are there antagonistic effects
Yeah.
of those residuals on cover crop species.
Yeah.
So I would really suggest reach out and look into those, because I think those are going to be beneficial.
Okay. We got time for a couple more questions. Liz told me I had time for one, but I'm gonna ask a couple. Sorry, Liz. I'm taking the prerogative of doing that. One is, as I listen to all of this, there are some challenges with cover crops, but maybe if folks tap into a little bit their creative side, and there's a little bit of fun associated with how do we make it work for that operation and for the objectives you have, maybe that brings a little bit more, complexity of how do we make it work in an agricultural operation.
Oh yeah, and I think some of our early adopters of cover crops have done just that. They recognized that they needed to do something different.
Yeah.
And so they took on the challenge of how do we do it? And they had this curiosity and creativity, and they really did a fantastic job of being able to really champion it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we have to do. I'm known. I have a vegetable garden at home. Granted, it's smaller than it was years ago,
Okay.
but I often find myself planting some cover crops in it just to see what they do.
Yep. My neighbor does the same thing. Buckwheat, I remember seeing out there quite a bit. So thinking about this, if you're thinking about cover crops, what are your thoughts on harvesting your own cover crop for seed to plant back?
I think that's again, it kind of comes back to how do we get the infrastructure in place to be able to do this, right? And I think one of the ways is to grow our own.
Okay.
And I think there is that opportunity to do that, right? Make sure that you're thinking about it from a seed production standpoint, right? And so most of the time we're thinking about small grains from this perspective, because they're just a little bit easier if we're going to produce our own, right? And so think about, what is the seeding time, the seeding rate really for a grain production system, because that's different than maybe what we'd recommend in a cover crop system.
Okay.
Think about fertility. Again, if we're thinking about it from a cover crop, we're not putting nitrogen on. We don't want that, right?
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden, from a grain production standpoint, we do want nitrogen.
Yeah.
And then be scouting it, looking for the foliar diseases and insect pathogens that may be carrying some viruses with us, right? So we may have to put out a fungicide to be able to get the quality of seed that we need.
Yeah.
And then once it's harvested, get it tested.
Okay.
Know what your germination is, know what your seeds per pound is, so you can really make sure that you're getting seeding rates that you want as a cover crop then.
And probably it can go left unspoken, but not hybrid rye.
Very good point. Yeah, so I would say not hybrid rye. Well, one, because there's a plant back restriction on it.
Yep.
And so we don't want to do that because that would create some challenges. But the second point of that is it is more expensive.
Yeah.
And you get the yield potential out of it, but as a cover crop seed, hybrid rye is probably not where we're going to be going anytime soon, just because of the cost of that seed.
Yeah. And then if in those acres that you've planted that, or harvested that rye, then you maybe have a lot of opportunities for mixes and getting the growth of a lot of those things.
Very much so.
Late summer and early fall.
Yeah, and if you're doing a small grain, you've likely voluntarily seeded some small grain out there. So now that's a great opportunity to come in after harvest and drill seed a legume, or some, you have some indrows where you have more compaction. Maybe that's where you put in some brassicas that really can work on those areas.
Yeah. So we need to go to some of our logistical slides here, but don't go away. We're going to have time for some more questions and some last thoughts for Mark. But I do want to thank our key partners for Iowa Learning Farms, and that is the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. If you if you made it and listened to Mark and I this long, I hope you had as much fun as we did. I think it's fun. I always enjoy visiting with Mark, and as I said, I do listen and I do learn something from him every time. But if you are wanting to get a CCA CEU, please email your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number to Elena Whitaker, and that's ALENAW at iastate.edu. Do that by 5 o'clock today. Again, your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number, and Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. Let's put a plug. Oh, the voluntary demographic survey. I got ahead of myself with wanting to plug the webinar for next week. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one survey response is needed for 2026. So if you've done it already, thank you very much. If you're willing to do it, you can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Now I get to plug the webinar for next week. And talk about something important. Cover crops are important, but also our soils are. And so we have Isaac Larson, that's an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, is going to talk about the present, past, and future of soil erosion in the Midwest United States. So please tune in next week to hear from Dr. Larson. And as always, this webinar, we're recording it on multiple computers, so hopefully one of them works. This webinar and all other webinars are archived on the Iowa Learning Farms website, or subscribe to our YouTube channel on cover crop, or on webinars. I'm thinking cover crops. Subscribe to that YouTube channel, get alerted when there's a new archived webinar, but this one will be up there shortly. Okay. Okay. We got a couple questions, and actually this brings me to a point. If you like this format and have ideas for other guests, please let us know. You can email Elena. She'll take all your suggestions. You can email them to me. I'm pretty easy to find, because there was one here about fall grazing, and that might not be quite as much in your wheelhouse.
Probably not.
And so, you know what? We're gonna Shelby Gruff. Exactly. So now we got Wesley Everman, we got Allison Robertson, and now we're going to get Shelby Gruss. So, keep them coming, we're going to get somebody on and have a conversation about thinking about what mixes might work for sheep or cattle. I generally think about cattle, but maybe we can think about sheep and what cover crop mixes might work best for
yeah.
them.
So if I think about that from a fall grazing perspective, I like the oats. They're going to be a little bit more robust and fast growing than, say, a cereal rye. You might even look at some of the brassicas like collards or kale, or I'll miss some of the other ones, right? But there's some others that are going to be a little bit more leafy, and they're going to grow a little bit quicker.
Okay.
Not put as much in the roots as they would in their shoots, right? And those would be great, examples of things that could work there.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about annual cover crops here. Any work going on around perennial cover crops?
There is. So if I go back, it's already probably 20 to 25 years ago, some of the first perennial work that I'm aware of was Kira clover.
Oh, yeah, we did Kira clover at our drainage site. Yeah.
And I've been told that a couple of those farmers that played with this maybe still have a little bit of Kira clover growing. Hard to get established, but once it got established, it's hard to kill.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, there is some work, right? And now more recently, there's a collaborative, I won't get all the names right, but led out of Iowa State here. So Raj Raman and Ken Moore and Shizhang Fei.
Yeah.
And then I think Corteva's involved in that, and there's some farmer
Land
partners.
Institute.
Yeah. So there is work on that. Maybe that's if there's enough interest, keep putting some things in the chat, and Matt will find Raj.
We routinely go to Raj and Dan to get them to speak. So I think they'll, maybe we have a three-way panel, and I get to moderate Dan and Raj. So I think we got time for a couple more questions here. One is, first one here is, how does atrazine affect these cereals?
Oh, that one I don't fully know. We haven't seen it be a problem, an overall problem with establishing the small grains in the fall. And I think part of that's just because we're getting, where we're using that atrazine, it's early enough and we get enough rainfall, so it hasn't been problematic. I think in a dry year, that's when maybe we could get some issues that pop
Okay.
up. Combination of dry year and kind of maxing out our rate on that.
Okay.
But again, Wes Everman would be a
Okay.
really great one for that.
Good and great segue because Elena, always quick on the draw here, says March 25th is Allison Robertson. So that'll be good to talk about kind of diseases
Yep.
and plant pathogens. That discussion will be well over my head. So I'm gonna, I might be in trouble on that one. And then April 15th is Dr. Wesley Everman. So I think, right about the time that we might be thinking a bit about weed suppression out there. So,
Yep.
okay, we do have oh yeah, somebody asked about when the cover crop for weed management day. So that's April 15th again. Okay, what is the average any idea what the average cost per acre for cover crops and where folks might look for, either resources for, how to do cover crops or maybe even for, financial resources, maybe if they're, wanting to just get started in this?
Sure. So there is a lot of cost share out there right now. And so I typically, my gut reaction is send them to the NRCS district office. They know all of these pools of funds, right? I believe it's the Iowa Ag Water Alliance also has a really nice publication that talks about the various state, federal, and even non-agency type funding available, right? PFI,
I think
soil and water outcomes.
I think the Conservation Technology Information Center has a
Something
new
like that,
resource
too.
for that to try to make connections for resources that might be out there.
So there's a lot out there. Some you can stack, some you can't. You might have to dig a little bit, but there's a lot out there, right? So what is the actual cost of these, right? So I think of kind of on the low end, we're probably, I'll say $25 to $35 an acre, right?
Okay.
That's going to be a cereal grain. It's probably going to be flown on. That's on the low end.
Yeah.
I've seen some, where we're doing some mixtures and we're using a UAV or other things, right? Now we get up to $50 or even $60 an acre, right? So I think it all depends on what are you doing? Like, what's your seeding method? What, is the seed species you're using?
Are you
Or
able to seed it
mixtures?
yourself, or do you have to?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So that all comes into play, right? And
Yeah.
I would generally say that for people that are starting out, a lot of times the cost share does cover that cost of getting it seeded.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there's some economists that may argue with me, but I would say that the spring termination, we really don't need to worry about that as an added cost.
Okay.
Because we're likely putting out a herbicide ahead of planting or, shortly after planting of that corn or soybean crop. And so I don't look at that as an added cost. I look at it as we have to change how we're doing it, but it's a cost that we've already got factored into, our corn or soybean cost of production.
Yeah. So, kind of going along with that question about, maybe rethinking, that spring application of herbicide, can you think about how this idea of, how you kind of have to make the whole system change a little bit to incorporate cover crops and, but that it may be making a more resilient system by including those cover crops, or maybe some, top couple things that folks need to think about as to change their system to have the best chance of success with cover crops?
Yeah. So first thing, make sure that you're already in a no-till system. I actually think being no-till before adopting cover crops is really the easier step. You can do both at the same time. Okay. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. But it's easier if you're already doing no-till. And then I think of it as probably the herbicide program, making sure that you don't have residuals out there that are going to impact you. And then it really is how are you going to get the cover crop seeded, and the timing on that, and trying to get that to work, right? Because if you don't get establishment, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And then now you're thinking about termination and the timing of termination based on the growth and relationship to when you want to plant corn or soybeans, right? So those are kind of the nuts and bolts of kind of the when do you do this, right? Yeah. Quite honestly, I'm probably more apt to suggest an aerial seeding of like cereal rye or oats for someone that's just starting out.
Okay.
Right. It's easy. It doesn't take a lot of time on their part. And then in the spring, doing a glyphosate burn down. Ahead of corn, I like that burn down 10 to 14 days ahead of
Okay.
corn planting. Make sure it's actively growing first,
Yeah.
though.
And how about killing before soybeans? I had one producer say, they plant green and they find better success planting soybeans planting green rather than if that rye residue is just starting to starting to die.
Yeah, so I'm hearing those things, right?
Okay.
And so what I'm really hearing is it's better to plant green or brown.
Okay,
You
that's
don't
what
want yellow.
Yeah, okay, that's exactly what that. Yep,
So,
yep,
but again, we tend to say that it really comes down to planter performance, right?
Okay.
So if you're paying attention to your planter settings and the function of the planter,
Okay.
you can plant really into about anything,
Yeah.
right? And so it's a matter of making sure that you have, if you're terminating it, get it terminated so you have a good quick kill on it.
Yeah.
And maybe then you have less likelihood that you're planting into yellow, right?
Yeah.
I personally get a little bit worried about planting green just because I've seen the challenges of, well, the sprayer was coming 2 days later and then we got 3 weeks of rain.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So I myself am a little bit more risk averse to planting green unless I know like maybe the planter is following the sprayer.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
That mentality.
Yeah. Okay. Liz gave me she's given me the cue that the last question. So I'm going to turn it to Mark for any last comments, any last thoughts about, farmer adoption, scaling this up, give you the last word.
So I really, this has been a great discussion. We could probably have gone on for probably 2 hours. And
If Liz would let us, we would have gone on longer. I'm just kidding.
Our audience might start to drop off.
Yeah, exactly. If anybody's still with us, they're like, no way, I'm done with these two.
But I think, I think it's really important to recognize that, we're only at 5 to 10% adoption. I'll call them, those are the easy acres, right? They're the innovators. They're the curious people that want to try to make it work. Now we need kind of those early adopters, those innovators to really start to go out and talk to their neighbors and self
use their voices.
Self-promote, right?
Yep.
But then we also need to just recognize that we're going to have to, it's going to be harder to nudge, the next round of adoption. And it's going to take a wide effort, right? It's going to be those earlier adopters. It's going to be, universities and other groups that are involved in crop production to really encourage that and to push that, right?
And a real, in a collective effort and trying to, I think it behooves us at the universities to work to document the benefits of this and think about this long term as well, that, this having that cover crop in there can hopefully help us keep our soil in place. And, that's kind of, I still think that's something that, and we need to be concerned about all the other water quality issues. I work on it on a daily basis, but soil erosion and protecting our soil resource is so critical.
Yeah, we have to be thinking about this and figuring out what are those, I'll call them the light bulb moments that we can help turn that light bulb, right?
Yep.
That way we get better adoption and more adoption, right?
Okay. Thanks so much, Mark. It's always great to have you, to visit with you. And I hope, as I said, maybe nobody's left here, but thank you all for listening in today. I hope you have a great rest of the week. As I said before, please let us know if you have topics that and it doesn't have to be cover crops that we have this type of dialogue. We thought we'd try something new with this. It may fall flat on, we might fall flat on our face and we do a couple more and we're done, but that's up to you as audience members. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the week.